Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the reloading bench. So today I'm hoping to create a video series regarding suppressors and compensators, air strippers and things like that, and how it affects your air rifle. So today we're going to focus on three of what I consider to be the main brands when it comes to sound suppression in air rifles. The first one we've got here is the Kral silencer, and this one comes standard with a lot of the Kral guns. For example, the Kral puncher breaker comes standard with this suppressor. The next one we're going to talk about is, of course, the Weihrauch, and this is my personal suppressor. I love this thing. It's quiet and lightweight. And lastly, which I think is probably one of the sleekest and best looking silencers on the market, it is the Walther silencer. This one has probably the best finish on it. It's the shortest, and we'll compare the sound suppression in this video as well. So, starting off with the Kral, build quality is fairly good. It's not excellent, but it's on par with what you pay for. So it's definitely a nice feature that they add this to some of their guns in order to get you started without having to reach for your wallet a second time. Now this one, the finish on the silencer is not as great as the Weihrauch or the Walther silencer, but it does its job. You can see the texture on the silencer is almost like a wire brush finish, and then of course I'm thinking it's anodized as well. Important to note that all three of these silencers have a cylindrical body and two end caps, one with a 1/2 inch UNF and the other one with a flat face and your hole. So let's take a closer look at this Kral silencer. So the Kral silencer, first off, let's take a look and speculate what the materials of this might be. It's cold to the touch, so it's definitely some kind of metal. We've got a little magnet here, and it does not stick to the ends or to the body. Just to prove this is in fact a real magnet, here we've got a Leatherman, and it sticks to it very well. So it's non-magnetic, it's a non-ferrous metal. Might be some kind of stainless. You get two types of stainless steel, one ferrous and one non-ferrous. However, I really doubt that it is that, because it is an expensive material. There are no markings on the Kral silencer. Absolutely nothing. No marking, no indication of what caliber, no indication of anything. So very generic, plain, straightforward silencer. So the diameter of the outside tube is going to be around 30 millimeters. So 30 mil tube. I don't know the wall thickness, so we can't calculate the internal volume actually. However, if you look down it, you do see some form of baffles. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. But the hole that passes through, the diameter of the hole that passes through is quite large, which leads me to believe this is a one do-all silencer for 177, 22, 25, maybe even 30 cal. It's quite large. I'd stick to 22 with this if I'm not sure. You don't want to tear your silencer apart or damage anything in the process. So like I've said, it's a non-ferrous metal, it's non-magnetic. The diameter of the tube is 30 mil, and the overall length is going to be around 200 millimeters. So we've got a 200 millimeter long silencer, which then screws onto your rifle. It is worth noting that the 1/2 inch UNF threads are slightly recessed. They do not start right at the edge there. So that is going to bring the silencer slightly over your barrel. So you've got to make sure that you've got a little bit of space between your threads and where your barrel band is, if you have a barrel band, or your cylinder, so that you don't end up knocking your cylinder or pushing the barrel out of its original place. Then the next point I want to look at is weight. So the reason why I want to look at weight of the silencer is when we are talking about any kind of projectile coming out of a barrel, or even a bow for that matter, you have to take into consider harmonics. And the weight at the end of a barrel affects the harmonics. So we've got 3 different silencers. The Weihrauch is probably the lightest of the 3, we'll confirm that. And then we're going to go out and test what this means to you out in the field in terms of accuracy, suppression, and velocity. Recently I've heard some people talk about when you're adding a silencer to a firearm, you are extending the barrel because the gases are contained, so they push the projectile forward. And I don't think this is true, because the way that a silencer works is you've got baffles inside. Now I'm going to try to draw a crude diagram here. You've got baffles inside of the silencer, which strips the air away from the projectile, just like in a firearm. So with a suppressor, you are going to basically, you've got your tube. Now you've got your tube, and inside of that tube, most of the time you have what's called K baffles. And these baffles sit, so if the barrel of the rifle sits over here and the projectile is going to go through the suppressor this way, the baffles will sit like this. Something like this, okay? Where you have a ring and that ring is tapered, which means the gases that escape will get trapped and the bullet can pass on into the next chamber. And so every time you are reducing the amount of gas that flows into the next chamber, and at long last your projectile will exit the barrel cleanly, and if it's a good suppressor, with very little to no turbulent air around the pellet, which means that the pellet will be a little more stable. And that's what we're going to test as well today. We're going to test first off a grouping where we don't have any suppressor on the gun, and the gun we're using is the Kral Maxi S, very accurate 22 caliber air rifle. And I think we're going to be using the 18 grain JSB. They seem to perform the best at the lower velocities that the Kral Maxi produces. So my theory is that the notion that a silencer adds that much length to your barrel in terms of giving it a boost in velocity is total crap. I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong, I'll admit it. We're going to look at the Chrono numbers as well. But in effect, that's what's happening. Your projectile is coming through, and with each successive baffle, there is less turbulent air around to create the sound explosion. Because when a projectile exits the barrel of a rifle, right? It exits the barrel. Now you've got all of that gas which propelled the projectile forward, all of a sudden exploding out of the sides. They've got nowhere else to go. As soon as that projectile leaves the barrel, they explode out the sides, and that's what creates the sound blast, the sound wave. Remember, sound is just compression in air. Now, the silencer mitigates that by controlling the amount and the flow of that air out of the muzzle. So we are going to test a couple of things today, but getting back on to talking about the Kral silencer, we are going to have a look at its weight. Alright, let's just leave it like that. So it looks like it comes up to 170, around 170 grams. That's 150, 60, 70, 170 grams. So 170 grams, it's got a 30 mil diameter and it's around 200 millimeters in length. Next up, we've got what I consider to be the intermediate, and that would be the Weihrauch. Now the Weihrauch is clearly some kind of anodized aluminum with also a tubular construction with two end caps, one that's slightly beveled where the projectile exits the barrel, and one where it looks to be a steel insert. I might be wrong. I think it's just the aluminum that's been tapped for a 1/2 inch UNF. So taking a look at the diameter of the Weihrauch, the diameter of the Weihrauch is also 30 millimeters. So exactly the same diameter as the Kral. This should be an interesting comparison. Now, one significant difference when you look down the tube of the Weihrauch is the diameter of the hole that passes through all the baffles is slightly smaller if you compare them direct side to side. So we might see better sound suppression with the Weihrauch. The overall length of the Weihrauch in millimeters is going to be around 194. Okay, 194. So only slightly smaller than the Kral. But one significant difference is that the Weihrauch is way lighter. If you pick the two up, you can immediately feel the difference in weight. And that comes back to the material used and of course the thickness of the materials used. So taking a look at the weight of the Weihrauch, it weighs on the dot 110 grams. So a fair bit lighter than the Kral silencer. And then the last one, which represents the most expensive and probably the best built, is the Walther. The Walther silencer. The Walther silencer is considerably smaller than either the Weihrauch or the Kral, and its weight is somewhat comparable to the Kral silencer if I just feel it in my hand. Taking a look at the material used on the Walther silencer from Harmonics, I don't think it's going to be steel. I might be wrong. No magnet, nothing there, doesn't pull on it. So definitely, once again, non-ferrous metal. Probably aluminum as well. Some kind of billet aluminum, high-grade aircraft aluminum or something like that. So next up, taking a look at the diameter of the outside of the tube. And here we see we've got about a diameter of 32. So a slightly larger diameter than either the Weihrauch or the Kral. And the theory behind this that I have is because it is shorter, they have to make the tube wider in order to obtain the same volume. Okay, so to quickly summarize before we go out to do our harmonics testing, we've got the Walther, which comes in at around 140 grams, has an outside diameter of 32 millimeters and is about 135 millimeters long. Up next, we've got the Kral silencer. The Kral silencer weighs about 170 grams. Its outside diameter is 30 millimeters and its length is around 200 millimeters. And lastly, we've got the Weihrauch silencer. The Weihrauch silencer weighs about 110 grams. Its outside diameter is 30 millimeters and its weight and its length is around 194 millimeters. So, in terms of weight, the Weihrauch is our lightest. The next one is going to be our Walther silencer, and lastly we have our Kral silencer. In terms of length, the Walther is the shortest, up next is the Weihrauch, and lastly is the Kral. So we're going to see how each one of these performs on the rifle to see if the weight of the muzzle brake or the silencer in this case makes a difference in the group size and velocity. We know for a fact the point of impact is going to shift, the heaviest being the largest point of impact shift, I'm guessing, and the lightest having the minimal point of impact shift. So we're going to go out to the 25 meter range. I'll zero the gun with the 18 grain JSBs using one mag. We'll use the same mag throughout the testing to keep things nice and fair. We'll top the gun off every 10 shots to 200 bar to make sure there is no creep in the velocity that can obscure the results, as well as the velocity increase or decrease, changing the point of impact on the paper at 25 meters. So target is downrange at 25 meters. Just checking the focus. Looks good. Here we go. Bare barrel did not do too badly. I would say that's a pretty fair representation of what an average group would look like. We can see here that the last shot was 852.7 feet per second. The weight is 18.13 grain, and if we press S2, we go on to shot number 5. The power factor is 15. The average energy in foot-pounds of energy is 29.14. The average velocity was 851, the minimum 847, the max 856, deviation 9, and standard deviation of 3 feet per second. That is excellent. So going back, I just want to make a record of the average velocities, 851 feet per second with the JSB 18.13. Right, so we have shot our first 5. It's time to fill the gun back up to 200 bar to get on with the next test. Right, so the very first silencer we are going to test is going to be the Walther silencer from Umarex. The gun is unloaded and clear. Give it a little bit of a torque, and there we have it. That is a very nice and compact silencer. Right, so we are back at the bench to try and make some sense out of these groups. So, starting with the bare barrel, we shot a 5-shot grouping up here. Now this 5-shot grouping is quite tight and exactly what I like seeing from this Kral Maxi. If I measure it from the very edge to the edge of the jagged hole, we get a grouping of around 9.3 millimeters. So bare barrel, we got about a 9.3 millimeter grouping from edge to edge. That is what this rifle can do when you know its ins and outs and trigger control properly. 9.3 millimeters at 25 meters is extremely accurate for a 5-shot grouping, and we didn't have ideal conditions. So up next we mounted the Walther silencer. Right, so the grouping with the Walther silencer came out to be around 10.2 millimeters, which is quite respectable in the conditions that we had. So, moving on then, we mounted the Weihrauch silencer. And the Weihrauch silencer was, to my ear, the quietest, giving a lower tone than the Walther silencer. The Walther silencer was probably the quietest, but it has a slightly higher pitch than the Weihrauch silencer. I think it's due to the increased capacity of the Walther silencer, the decreased capacity of the Walther silencer, that we get a slightly higher tone sound. Now with the Weihrauch mounted, I think it was the quietest to my ear, and we got a grouping that was, if I measure it edge to edge, just finding the largest side that would be there, around 7.4 millimeters. That is incredible. 7.4 millimeters, 5 shots, 25 meters. This is really an excellent silencer. It quieted down the noise and it got our groupings a little tighter. And then lastly, we move on to the Kral silencer. Now the Kral silencer is probably one of the more budget-friendly silencers. It did fairly well with sound suppression. We did see a very large point of impact shift compared to the point of impact shifts that we got with the Weihrauch or the Walther silencer. The point of impact shift was almost double, but I think that's due to the weight of the Kral silencer. So that's what accounts for that large point of impact shift downwards. And if we measure that group, we get to a largest edge to edge group size of around 14.1. So 14.1, still a very respectable group. Comparing the test results, we see that the bare barrel doesn't do too badly. We shot under a 10 millimeter group at 25, which I consider to be the threshold for a very good and accurate rifle. So moving on to the Walther silencer, we pulled one of the shots a little high due to bad trigger control, but the rest of the shots landed nicely in a neat little pattern, 3 of them going through this hole and 1 of them passing just slightly to the right, and of course the one going high. And we ended up with a 10.2 millimeter group, omitting that top shot. Moving on to the Weihrauch silencer, which did the best. We got a 7.4 millimeter group, which is pretty much what I expected out of this rifle with the Weihrauch mounted. There's a reason why I own this silencer. And lastly, we've got the Kral silencer, which gave us a group size of around 14.1 millimeters. 5 shots, 25 meters, less than ideal conditions. I think all of these did fairly well. I think the winners would be the Weihrauch and the Walther silencer. I think the Walther silencer is going to be the best option if you are afraid of extending your rifle too much. If you want the quietest silencer for my gun, then the Weihrauch would be the best option, and we only sacrifice a little length to obtain that. The interesting thing about this is the velocities were kind of very inconsistent between the silencers, and I find that extremely interesting. Remember, we topped up to 200 bar each time in between each testing, so there's no way that we can attribute the velocity difference to the power curve. We topped off to 200 bar, took the same amount of shots each time, only 10, 5 over the chronograph, and then a 5-shot grouping. And we topped off the rifle again before moving on to the next silencer. So here are the velocities to recap. With a bare barrel, we got an average of 851 feet per second. With a standard deviation of 3 feet per second. Then, with the Walther silencer, we got an average of 847 feet per second and a deviation of 4 feet per second. Right, 4 feet per second versus standard deviation of 3 feet per second in the bare barrel. That is so little, I wouldn't even worry about that. That 4 feet per second is less than the velocities would differ normally. So it's not such a high number to consider. If we get up to the 10 feet per second spread between shots, then I would start being a little worried. Moving on to the Weihrauch. With the Weihrauch, we got an average of 850 feet per second and a standard deviation of 3 feet per second. And lastly, with the Kral, we saw a decrease in velocity, which I find extremely interesting. Now, the velocity that we got with the Kral was around 838 feet per second. That is a noticeable difference between the velocities. The difference between 850 and 847 feet per second do not worry me at all. Neither does the difference in the standard deviation between 3 and 4 feet per second. But here's the kicker. The velocities dropped down to 838 feet per second and the standard deviation went up to 6 feet per second. That is a measurable difference between 3 and 6 feet per second. I find this really interesting. Very, very interesting test. It's not extremely conclusive, except we saw that with the Weihrauch silencer, which I think is the best in my opinion, we saw the bare barrel group shrink down quite considerably from 9.3 to 7.4. That 0.1 difference there might be a measuring error or just a trigger control difference in slight variations. But that is 2 millimeter difference between 9 and 7. So I would say that the Weihrauch silencer did in fact help the grouping out. So what did we learn from this? We learned that different silencers and the different weights of the silencers make a difference to our point of impact and our group size. Never mind the suppression thereof. All three of these did very well with sound suppression. The Weihrauch being the winner. Next up, I would say the Walther silencer. It gave a slightly higher pitch than the Weihrauch silencer out of my rifle. So I would lean more towards the Weihrauch because of the tone difference. And lastly, the one that did fairly comparable to the Walther was the Kral. I was very surprised at how effective it was at sound suppression. Now, I'm not very happy with what it did to our standard deviation and our velocity. The velocity difference between 850 and 838 is a huge difference in terms of only mounting a suppressor. That is a measurable difference in velocity to which we have to pay a little more attention. Now, there are many theories to why this is. I won't go into that too much. Well, what we do know is the Weihrauch is the lightest, next is the Walther, and lastly is the Kral silencer. It is the heaviest. So a couple of things are going on in terms of the harmonics. But I find it really interesting that the silencers shot about the same velocity, So we can positively disprove that with an air gun, adding a silencer does not increase or decrease the muzzle velocity significantly. And then we get to Mr. Kral silencer. Now this is a very small sample size, so drawing a large scale conclusion from this is not going to be very beneficial. However, for my testing and what I do, I think this is a really interesting test and a useful test in terms of finding what your rifle likes best. Now, there's another guy that did a similar test, much more in depth, with a firearm, a 6.5 Creedmoor, and he also found that when he shifted over from 6.5 Creedmoor to 6.5 Grendel, and the muzzle brakes and devices that he fitted to the 6.5 Creedmoor that did the best on the Creedmoor, that tightened up the groups, did not necessarily translate to the 6.5 Grendel. Both 6.5 millimeters, the velocities do differ. He was talking about muzzle brakes and specifically the weight of the muzzle brake, but there is some third element going on as well. It is not only the length and the weight of the silencer. There's a third element which I'm thinking is the turbulent air that flows through the chambers. And the most effective silencer should, in theory, give you the best groups. Now, getting back to our weight factor again, when you talk about the weight, then you've got to take into consider that as well, not only the dirty or disturbed air around it. So guys, thank you very much for sticking with me right to the end. I know it's been a long one, and if you've got any suggestions for muzzle brakes or devices to fit to the end of my Kral Maxi so we can do further testing, please drop me a comment down below. I'd appreciate it a bunch. Also, just a quick note, I want to say thank you to pelletguns.com for making this test possible by supplying us with the different suppressors, so we can have a little bit of a larger sample size than only one. Right guys, thank you very much. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.